when Don was saying, look, the neurons don't exist, which I'm just going to pick up this pen and say this pen doesn't exist prior to looking at it. Sorry, prior to observation. And then you were saying, no, it can exist. But at the same time, this is made out of consciousness. Can you not reconcile those two views by saying the pen is observing itself because the pen is made up of subjective experiences? Like, is there a way to make the objective from the subjective?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't quite put it that way that the pen is observing it. Well, I mean, maybe I could talk a little bit more about the inspiration for the contemporary panpsychist resurgence, which very much draws on crucial work from the 1920s by Bertrand Russell. And it was sort of the...
Sorry to interrupt. It would also be helpful if you were to distinguish it from idealism, panpsychism.
Yeah, sure. Let me do that. So it's very much the somewhat rediscovery of this crucial work from Russell, particularly in the analysis of matter, that has made panpsychism in the last decade go from something that was laughed at insofar as it was thought of at all to being a serious academic option that's taught to our undergraduates, published on, and so on. So what I think this connects a lot to what Don was saying as well. So what Russell was thinking very hard about in the 1920s was that the fact that our fundamental science, physics, is just purely mathematical, right? Something we kind of take for granted. And of course, that's very useful if you're a working physicist. You can get very precise predictions and so on. But Russell's thinking, what does it mean as a philosopher interested in the ultimate nature of reality, that our basic science is just equations? And what Russell concluded is that what it means is that our basic science isn't really telling us that much about what fundamental reality is. It's merely describing its mathematical structure. And so as far as physics is concerned, fundamental reality could turn out to be anything. As long as it has the right mathematical structure, you're going to get physics out of that. That's all physics cares about. So the contemporary Bertrand Russell-inspired panpsychists exploit this, and the idea is that what we have at the fundamental level of reality are very simple conscious entities, networks of simple conscious entities interacting in very simple, predictable ways. Through their interactions, they realize certain patterns, certain mathematical structures. And then the idea is those mathematical structures just are what we call physics. So we sort of get physics out of underlying facts about consciousness. So I don't think you can get consciousness out of physics, but I think you can get physics out of consciousness. I think we know that can be done. I think we should think of Russell as the Darwin of consciousness. I think he essentially solved all the mysteries here. So really, but what this ends up as, and this is where I think it maybe contrasts with what I think of as Don's idealism, is that there's a kind of identity between consciousness and physical reality. As I sometimes put it, matter is what consciousness does. Really, there's just consciousness stuff, but physics is the mathematical structure of that consciousness stuff. As Stephen Hawking said on the last page of A Brief History of Time, physics doesn't tell us what breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe. For the Russellian panpsychist, it's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. So I just connecting it to what Don was saying, I mean, Don seems to have this idea that, like, this physics he's attracted to, or this new physics, makes it more problematic we need to look elsewhere than space-time. We need to look for new entities. But from my perspective, my Bertrand Russell-inspired perspective, physics has never told us, ever, what reality is like. It's just a bunch of maths. It's not, unless you go for Max Tegmark's view and think, the universe is made up of maths, then physics just is not in the business of telling us what has never been in the business. So it doesn't matter whether the amplituhedron ends up being the right stuff, or whether we get Bohmian space-time. It's just maths, and we'll always need something to fill out that mathematical structure, something to breathe fire into the equations. And for the panpsychist, the most parsimonious answer is consciousness, because we know consciousness exists. I think there are good reasons to think if you put just mathematical structure at the fundamental level, you're not going to be able to get consciousness out of that. But we know it can be done the other way around. And so that seems to me the more plausible view. So yeah, so that's kind of how I think about things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and everything you said, I agree with. So the only place where I would sort of go take the next step is to say, why just the laws of physics? Why not the consciousness? Why should we restrict our imagination to say that the laws of physics that we happen to know are all that consciousness has done? Why not say that there are an infinite number of other quote-unquote physics that consciousness chooses to play with? This is just one. Space-time physics is one, perhaps more trivial kind of physics that consciousness has chosen to make. Why should we put ourselves in a conceptual straitjacket and only work with the physics that we've seen? In the amplituhedron, it is parameterized by three integers, n, k, and m. And m is basically an integer that it dials up the different universes that you might choose. So with the amplituhedron, you can have our four-dimensional spacetime as the projection of this deeper structure, but you can also have an eight-dimensional spacetime. You can have spacetimes of 20, 30. In other words, you can already, with the new physics that they're finding outside of spacetime, you can choose which kind of spacetime universe you want to create. And our 4D one is just one of an infinite number of possibilities. And so already the physics in just the first decade of stepping outside of spacetime is saying, whoa, the spacetime projection of this deeper physics is clearly just one of an infinite number of projections. I'm saying, okay, let's go with what the math is saying. Consciousness is not in a space-time straitjacket. It's free to have an infinite number of completely different kinds of physics with different kinds of laws, and for us to be wedded to the space-time one is to limit our imagination about what consciousness can really do and what it really is.
I suppose I'm very strictly an empiricist on this point. Even people might find that surprising, given my philosophical views. But as I say, for the panpsychist, there's a kind of identity between. So the panpsychist will say, sometimes people say to me, well, what's the kind of mathematics of your theory? And my answer is, ask a physicist, right? So for the Bertrand Russell style panpsychist, it's the job of physics to identify what Russell called the causal skeleton of reality. Physics, the job of physics is to identify the mathematical structure of reality, the dynamics, and then our philosophical interpretation of that is that mathematical structure is filled out by consciousness, and because I think it's the best solution to the mind-body problem. But it's just a question for physics, or more broadly an empirical question. What are you've talked about the dynamics of consciousness and the dynamics of physical reality. For me, they're just the same thing, right? And so, okay, these infinite causal structures of consciousness, maybe they're possible, but I'm going to want empirical reason to think they're actual. I'm going to look for empirical grounds from physics to tell me what the dynamics of consciousness are, which for me is just equivalent to the dynamics of physical reality, the reality physicists are trying to articulate.
Of course, I'm on the same page. Whatever theories we propose about dynamics of consciousness outside of space-time, and if I propose all these other kinds of universes, if quote-unquote physical universes, then I would want to try to find some kind of empirical tests. Absolutely. So I agree with you on that. It's just that I don't think that we should a priori rule out the possibility that there are many, many more ways that consciousness can give rise to quote-unquote physics than the one that we happen to know. And as we start to think out of that box, we may be able to find clean empirical tests of that hypothesis.
Yeah.
I'm finding it difficult to see where you disagree. So is it, Philip, that, because it sounds like you all agree at your fundament that consciousness is at the fundament. But then, Philip, you believe Don is making a jump from there to something speculative and doing so with confidence? Or is it not that?
It's just that I suppose I'm happy to say this pen exists when we're not observing it. and I would say all the things about it a normal physicalist materialist would say. There's light bouncing off it, hitting our eyes. And yeah, I'm not... This talk of it's a data structure, that it's a headset we wear, I'm not fully seeing the motivation. I mean, maybe we should talk about the evolution stuff as well briefly, or which
Sure.
I guess is the other point where we disagree.
Maybe I'll just say one thing in reply here, just because of what you said, just brought up another way that I might get at this.
Drink some wine.
And that is to say that if you think of consciousness as fundamental and that I'm having conscious experiences, so I'm having an experience as of a pen, right? You held up a pen. And if I take consciousness to be fundamental, I can say I definitely know that I have the conscious experience as of a pen. Now, someone might come along and say, but in addition to your experience, there really is. There is a pen, and not just your experience of a pen. There is a pen, and I say, well, I don't know what the evidence is for that. I don't really need it. I can completely do my physics without any assumption that there's anything but the experiences, and I can write down the equations and not. So I don't see why I need this extra ontological baggage of the real pen. And pound. There is a pen. When I pound the table, there really is a pen. Well, I have an experience, and that's all I really need. So why do I need the real pen? Why don't I just say local realism is false? There is no real pen, but there is a real experience, and that's all I really need. And as Einstein put it, the laws of physics just basically are there to show us how we can predict new experiences from old experiences. Yeah,
well, I suppose, look, we want a theory that fits together the story we're getting from physics and the reality of consciousness. I suppose they're the two data points for me. But I mean, maybe we could agree on the fundamental story. I suppose I just think a lot of philosophers and philosophers of physics have come up with detailed and rigorous theories of emergence where we can make sense of the pen, not as a sort of extra thing in the ontology, just something, maybe just to take Dennett's view that it's a sort of a real pattern or something in the more fundamental.
What is a real pattern in Dennett's view?
So we've got the you could know all of physical reality at the level of fundamental physics, all that detail, but that's not very useful for many practical purposes. And I mean, maybe this connects with what you were saying, Curt, about sometimes it's not the fundamental thing that gives you the more information with less axioms or what have you. Some kind of ways of carving up reality. Dennett talks about the intentional stance when you treat something as an agent with thoughts and experiences, or the design stance when you treat something as a designed object. They can be more useful structures for prediction rather than trying to, work out from fundamental physics, when your alarm clock's going to go off or whatever.
If you enjoyed this Toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for Toe Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core Toe community. You'll also receive my top 10 toes. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.